Mark, I'm just going to hand over to you there. I was just filling time.
Sure, no problem. Thanks, Shane. I guess before I jump in, do you have any status on the ISO
Yep. The current status
verification?
is nothing has changed. We're still on target for the ballot to finish September 22nd. And after that, we still are looking at a publication within 6 weeks as an international standard. If there are some comments received during the comment phase which require a secondary ballot, that ballot would take place over an 8-week period, but we currently have no indication that will be necessary.
Okay, great. All right. Can everybody see my slides?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Just the usual stuff. Just always helpful to do a very quick reminder of what we're trying to achieve on this version of the spec. We already have a 2.0 out, formally out, and we now have a 2.1, which is waiting for the ISO blessing. Once we have that blessing, then unless there's any changes to that, what we have will pretty much go out as is. And then what we're really doing here, embarking on the next version, but we're not expecting the next version to be a big change. I think part of that is to get some experience working with the ISO organization on how do you rev up a document once you have one, certified or sponsored. Now, we're going to talk about some of the feedback in a second. Some of it may recommend us to consider a 2-tier approach here, where we might want to go out with a minor revision, like a 2.2 or 2.5. Some of the comments that we're receiving have to do with reformatting the spec considerably, like moving things around. It doesn't necessarily change some of the core semantics, but there's some recommendations about organization, which I think we should entertain that. But I believe that would probably be for maybe a more major release. And again, that's for us to discuss. Ultimately, we're on this spec, we're trying to get feedback from people that are currently conforming, people who are struggling to conform, and to remind people that this is really meant to be the basic core minimum set of requirements all quality compliance programs must adhere to. And once we get through the issues list, we'll start to discuss this potential of an exploratory new optional section on security vulnerabilities. Okay. It's always helpful, I think, to put up some core resource links. So there you have it. I like to begin each meeting now with the opportunity for people who will participate in that meeting, if they haven't either posted it by email or posted on our issues list, if they have any particular topics that they would like to see us talk about, this is an opportunity to do that now. So if you haven't entered it on the issues list, is there anybody who's joining today who wants to bring up some feedback that they have? Okay. So with that,
You're referring to new feedback, right?
Yeah, this is new feedback.
Provided.
Yes, new feedback that we haven't recorded yet. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's really 3 channels for feedback. There's the issues list on GitHub. There's the email list, which has been pretty quiet. And then there's this meeting where people can come, and if they just want to have a discussion about something without posting it somewhere, this is the opportunity here to speak up. Okay. So no new topics of this. I wanted to move over to some of the issues on the issue list. Marcel, actually, Marcel, you're here today, so that's good. We can get your feedback. Some of these things we started to discuss at the last meeting. So I try to overlap the 2 meetings because they're 2 fundamentally different time zones. And some of them might be a little bit repeat. And what I want to do is have those discussions occur, gather up some of that feedback posted on the issues list, and let that sit out there for a while for others to come along. Number 54 on our issues list, Marcel has pointed out that the program scope is something he believes needs to be defined. I'll let him speak a little bit more since he's here, but people can read it for the moment. So Marcel, do you want to add anything to this?
let me quickly look at this issue number again. So I think it's pretty much what we stated here. The program should reflect the program scope. It should be a definition. Otherwise,
So,
the definition of yeah. So I think
I'll see if I can bring it up.
our thought here was that when can you try it again? Yep, thanks.
Yeah.
The
Go
thought here was that at some point an organization should define the program scope, and all open source license compliance activity. Exactly. So,
No,
so I guess,
wrong one. I was going to bring up the spec. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah. So I think we were discussing a situation in a company where they have different open source activities, and some might be in scope and some might not be in scope, and therefore correctly in the spec we talk about program scope, and a program scope should be defined. And then I think going forward, when we talk about the program, it should refer back to the program scope, so that the program only covers what is in scope and not any other activities of open source which might not be in scope. So because in large organizations with different business units, different enterprises, different entities, etc., the program we look at should be brought up or defined for the program for the open source activities which are actually in scope. And
Yeah,
this for us was not completely. It also in discussions with clients, etc., was not completely clear that way so far. Do you understand what we mean?
Yeah. So I'm going to bring up the 1.4 where we define scope in the spec.
Yeah.
It actually probably got moved. Oh. You know what the problem I'm having is we changed version numbers between the 2.0 and 2.1. And
yeah, so it's 3.1.4 now. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. So I'll let people read the definition here. And basically what we're asking for is people to state their scope, right? And the scope is basically an opportunity for them to decide whether they're focused on their whole organization or just a specific product line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And back to your feedback. What you're saying is you want a more formal definition of what a program is.
Yeah, you've just been in the spec. When you now go to the definition part where we define scope, where we define program, so at the very beginning.
Right here. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the program scope. So this is where people should define their program scope. But when you go now to the beginning where we define the word program,
Here.
the definition is exactly program. Set of policies, processes, and personnel that compromise an organization's open source compliance, open source license compliance activities. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So here we say a program is something that defines the process, etc., from an organization. And later on, then we define the scope. And I think the program we are now talking about should define the policies, procedures, and personnel that compromise an organization's open source license compliance in this particular scope.
Mm-hmm. And here's your suggestion, yeah. So does anybody have any thoughts about that? Do people feel that this would actually add some additional clarification that's necessary? And maybe the other question to ask is, if we didn't do this update, would we be missing something?
Well, as I'm working with Marcel, it's obviously I'm obviously biased, but I believe we all read the specification the way it is intended to, that there is a certain program and a scope, and both of which have to be defined, and then things are just fine. And the feedback we just received is that this is hidden more or less later on, where in the scope that is defined. But actually, the program is the predominant part where we want to put this more, put this up front, so the questions don't arise. And after all, if a question arises, someone didn't get it. So we think it might be a valuable addition.
Yeah, I just checked my notes again. So I mean, the word program, I mean, or the term program is defined as we can read it here. And then we use the term program very often within the specification. And when we talk in the specification about, for example, in one-to-one, a documented list of roles and corresponding responsibilities for the different participants of in the program, etc. So we talk a lot about the program, and that there need to be processes and participants and policies for the program. But when we then check what is the program, we can read that the program is policies, processes, and personnel that comprise an organization's open source license compliance activities, which could be more than actually the stuff that is in scope. As I said, so we might have an organization where they have processes, etc., for one business unit, and then we want to have a policy, and we want to identify personnel, etc., for the program in this business unit, but they might have another business unit where open source is not managed yet correctly, and by this definition of program, this would be included, because the definition of program does not reflect or it does not narrow it down to a specific scope, but says it's for the whole organization, and this is not what we always find in companies.
Yeah, I do think it does help. I do think it helps make it very clear that we're talking about what you define your program to be in section 1.4. So I don't think it's a big leap to put this in. That's my perspective. Any other?
It's not most critical, but just a small precise.
Yeah, I think it's always helpful. We're always challenged by the need to have this, maintain it to be as simple as possible, like less is more kind of philosophy. However, whenever we can clarify something and it just does improve it somewhat, then we should. I think the other challenge here is, I think this is not a challenge to add this one in to the next revision, because I think it just helps clarify it. Some of the things I think you guys brought up and we're going to talk about next are bigger fundamental changes to the format.
Okay, then we move on to the next one.
Yeah. So if no one else has any other reservations here, I think we can go on, and I'll make the comments on the issue list. That seems like a reasonable change, and we'll see if others have any comments. I like to let them sit out there for a while.
Yeah.
Before we actually start to incorporate them. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next one. 55.
Yeah, next one, I hope, or I think it's also a small amendment only.
Yes.
We should include other legal entity as an example for third parties, as some people might not consider other legal entity within the organization as an other organization. Because here, when we define the term supplied software, we only say software that an organization distributes to third parties. And I mean, what we discuss a lot with customers here in Germany is that they distribute something within their organization to another legal entity, and then the discussion comes up: is this distribution or is it not? I mean, of course, it depends on the license terms in the very end, but in simple terms, when they distribute it from one legal entity to another legal entity, mostly it's considered distribution. And therefore, when we here only talk about third parties, they actually don't reflect that distributing it to another legal entity within the organization, this is actually a third party. For them, third party is someone outside of the organization. So that was here the thought of adding this example.
Great, thank you for that. Anybody have any additional comments or thoughts about that? I think in this instance, I'd just like to get a feedback from a few other legal people. I don't think I find it, I think it does add a little bit more clarification. The key I want to make sure is it doesn't put too much restriction on what people might think. So for example, right now we have other organizations. Some might feel that's good enough to interpret other legal entities. I'm not sure that's true, but the key is if it can add to the definition without restricting it too much on what people consider to be a distribution, I think it's a good piece of feedback. So I think what I would like to just have is just other legal people in other legal jurisdictions, speak to that as well. Okay.
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 Can we hear what they say? I'd like to
Yeah.
hear what the legal guys say before, I say, I think this is a good idea.
Yeah, I think what would be important for us to do is to leave it out there. I'll put a comment in the issues list as a follow-up to the point I just made that we're seeking other feedback. Now, some people may not want to provide that feedback with their name attached to it. Some people have no problems. I will, if they choose to be anonymous, I will go ahead and post it on their behalf. But I think that the idea is to start recording these notes in the issues list so other people can see it, and hopefully others will comment. The more people that comment, the more comfortable I get about, accepting in something. Okay.
Here's my issue with the other legal entities item. In a very global organization, and my company is also German owned, so I understand the legal entities issue. However, we are a global development organization. We have groups all over the world, all working together, all probably technically under different legal entities, but they have to share. So are we requiring that open source license compliance be a review be executed every time you try to share software with another team that you're working closely with? I just don't want to box us in to that degree.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. That's the kind of feedback I'm looking for. If people feel this might potentially put more restrictions on what we're trying to do here, then that would be. Go ahead.
One question is if it puts on more restrictions. The other question is if it's legally more correct. Because exactly this topic, Mary, you just mentioned is what we are discussing with global organizations. So exactly the same example actually that you are discussing, and that's where the discussions come up and say, okay, when one legal entity is providing software to another, is this now supplied software, and is it distribution, and do we need to be license compliant when we supply to one organization to another? And when we discuss it with our legal team from PwC, and we help our clients to define the processes, yeah, in the end, it's depending on each and every license, but very often, actually, we have to say, yeah, when you supply from one entity to another, open source compliance needs to be considered and needs to be followed. So,
well, let me ask a question. If the word other organizations, is that something that would enable a particular company to make their own distinction of what an organization is, and therefore they can just assume legal entities as well? I mean, is that generic enough? Or I understand that you highlighted the need for a legal definition, but this is actually not so much a legal document. And in fact, sometimes we are challenged by the words we use because some people take it very precisely. It's meant to more for a program and process document, right? So we don't make any we try not to be too legally based. And I don't know if that makes 100% sense, but this document is not to be read as a legal document, but more of a specification business process document.
And just jumping in there, you know, I think that's one of the architectural decisions, because there's so much variance between legal systems and individual nation application of laws that, you know, if we attempted to frame something, we'd end up framing it according to US or European civil law or so on. So instead of doing that, we provide a structure for business, and then the legal teams can ensure the corporation is applying correctly for their jurisdiction.
Yeah, my attempt is not to narrow it down to one particular jurisdiction, but more to what the license terms of open source licenses require.
Oh, sure. No, I just wanted to make the point regarding kind of, you know, Mark's note on the architecture of it. And I'm sure we'll get some great feedback from some legal people. And I know that some of our, you know, our members, like Hitachi's got over 1,000 companies in the group and so on. So I'm sure we'll get some pretty great feedback as we throw this out.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts here? Let me go ahead and proceed to the next item here. Okay, this is, I like the feedback in the sense that you're trying to get the document to flow better. So the intent is this, we should discuss it. The one thing we have to be thoughtful about is that the next revision of this, right, of the spec, and right now, again, we're juggling whether we're going to be a 2.2 or a 3.0. This might be something we would like to consider, but maybe we put this off to the major release. Maybe we're dealing with a minor release right now, but I think we can still discuss it. I think we should discuss it and then say, if we decide it's more of a major change, then we can move that into the next draft and get people to get more comfortable with that. But I'll let you speak to it a little bit more. Go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, we looked through the document and we applied the document, discussed the OpenChain Spec 2.0 now several times with clients. And before actually we used the OpenChain Spec, we also had a PwC document where we had a structure for a open source management system, actually based on the general compliance management systems as per the ISO standard and as per the German Prüfungsstandard for compliance management systems. And as I mentioned earlier, at some point to Shane already, it was very good to see that the OpenChain spec is covering all the important topics, but from our feeling and in terms of document flow, in a little different order to how we would expect it or how we thought it would be easier to read. So the suggestion came up to say, when we read this document, we should somehow start with a scope so that we know what is the following paragraphs and the following topics. And when we talk about the policy and about competences in personnel and staff and so on. So what is the scope, first of all? I think that's a very basic question which should be cleared directly at the beginning. And then we thought the policy would make sense as the next topic, and then awareness. And I think the other parts, like competence, for example, we would suggest to move to the second chapter where we talk about tasks, etc., because that fits better to the task and it can be combined, because we had the feeling that sometimes, particularly when it goes about around staff and competence, etc., that these topics are redundant or are not condensed at one point, and they show up several times within the spec. And therefore, moving this would lay it out a bit more clear from our feeling.
Yeah, it takes a little bit more of it. I think this could be a fairly lengthy discussion in that I actually like the idea that we're revisiting and seeing if the flow of the document works, or can we work better. I think that's a really good kind of feedback to receive. The question always is, can we recognize the good pieces of that feedback and then evolve the document slowly enough so it's not too dramatic of a change?
Mhm.
That's one of the things I'm going to struggle with. Not, it's one of the things I should struggle with, right? But I think that we first should decide whether these are good changes, and then decide what's the right place or time for them to occur. So
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, we thought this discussion was about the 3.0. For 2.2, these changes might be too fundamental but for a major release, this might be considered. And yeah.
So let's talk briefly about that. Since Shane, do you think that we might entertain this idea that we're going to do a 2.2, because then that would be an opportunity for us to continuously get feedback, but again, there would still be, it's a minor release really, and then start and then target that for maybe, I don't know, January, February. I'm just making up these on the fly, subject to obviously change, and then maybe think about a more major release, say a year from now.
I think we'd face a huge amount of pushback for an incremental release anytime in a near window to the ISO release. So, for instance, our automotive board member companies, just picking Toyota, it's going to take them years to get through the thousands of companies in their supply chain with the ISO release 2.1. So I think it's very good for us to work on the 3.0 release. I don't think we should target incremental, because we'd probably annoy the large companies where it's just simply, it's going to take years to deploy a version. But all of this feedback coming in is valuable, and I think we should start, we should aim for a 3.0 is basically the takeaway I have.
Okay, that's helpful. What about what are you thinking about in terms of the timing of that? Are you thinking a 3.0 in 12 months, 24 months?
I have a feeling that we're going to get so many comments in, it'll probably take us a couple of years to get finalized on a 3.0.
Okay.
But architectural stuff, which is going straight to the point, that we're getting from Julian and Marcel, architectural stuff would be a great place to start. And then we can hang the comments onto that and build out and show people a vision for the future.
Yeah, Shane, I think we talked about it at some point already. My feeling would also be that we should aim for a major release only in rather 2 or 3 years, because now when the ISO is coming out, and when 1 year later we say we have some fundamental changes, etc., no one will like this idea. So I think it really makes sense to stick with the current version and the ISO, and then after 3 years, 4 years, and actually, I mean, within the ISO process, there will be a revision of the standard of the ISO after a few years anyways. And I think it makes sense to have this and later stage, yeah.
Probably we're going to get a terrific amount of useful feedback as people deploy through the supply chain. So, it's not like we're going to end up with a dead document waiting on a timeline. As thousands of companies pick this up, we're going to have tens of thousands of comments. So there'll be plenty to work on. But, I think our spec is really solid as is. It works well. The standard we're deploying in ISO is suitable. So there's no hurry to replace it. But this entire process of being able to work on that replacement is vital to have in place and to have the ball rolling today onward. But I don't think we should hurry for a release.
Okay, that's helpful. Then I think then what we'll do is we're going to target a 3.0. It could be 18 months, 24 months out. And we'll just start to organize the feedback into 2 sets of groups, architectural, as you point out, and then more the minor comments as they come in. And maybe if those minor comments come in, we could even create a temporary FAQ to help people if they require certain clarification on the spec, that can address those until we come up with the next major release. Okay, so And I wanted to start that whole discussion about timing because these, again, it's a valuable kind of feedback to have. I think the question really will be now starting to talk through it all. And what I'll do is I'll bring up the next, point you have on the next issue, which is, I didn't have it in my PowerPoint, which is the number 57, right? Which is, again, it's another one. It's another major, suggestion to changing the document. So I think it's going to take a fair amount of time to discuss this. And what I need to do is review. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, this one, it starts with first. Yeah, we suggest to combine fifth bullet of 2.2 into this. I think actually, I don't know, we might have read it incorrectly or didn't understand it correctly or whatsoever, but I think here really that this is quite clear that it should be moved. I'm just trying to open up the document in the meantime.
Oh, you mean the actual document? Okay, so
because effectively, we are here in the section of effectively resourced. A process. And then we talk about a process exists for reviewing and updating the policy and supporting tasks. I mean, either this is named, there are sufficient resources to review and updating the policy, or it's a process where it says the reviewing and updating of the policy needs to be done, but then it shouldn't be under the section of effectively resourced, I think. And the same for a process exists for the resolution of open source license compliance issues. I mean, we talk about effectively resourced, we should say, okay, efficient resources need to be in place for resolution of the license compliance issues, or this is a process which should be taken to the license compliance process part and not be named under the effectively resource part. Or is it just the wording that I picked up incorrectly?
I have to study it a little more. Yeah. What I want to do is maybe even take the draft and try to adjust and make the changes, kind of like a what if, and look at it. But what I do appreciate is, having a fresh set of eyes on it and trying to read this with a certain logical flow. And when you think we have redundancies, we should address those as well.
Yeah, perhaps it's just also, when you open up the actually spec, do you have it?
Yeah, I do.
And when you go to section 2.2 or 3.2.2?
Now, are we talking about the 2.0 or 2.1?
The under requirements further down, and now 3.2.2. No, a bit further down, 3.3 dot.
Oh, here.
Further down.
Oh, 3 point, which one?
3.2.2.
3. This is actually, this is the actual ISO version.
Yeah.
So I'd have to go and pull up the other one. The challenge is, the numbering is off. Yeah.
Yeah, scroll a little bit down to effectively resource. Further down. So a bit further down.
I think effective is
stop, bit up.
Yeah.
Here we are. So when you see now, here's the numbering and the bullet points. So we have bullet point for assign accountability, and then a bullet point for program tasks sufficiently resourced. And now program tasks which need to be sufficiently resourced are mentioned in the next 2 points. And then another process is mentioned, which needs to be effectively resourced. So either this bullet, which is now a black, needs to be changed to a round circle and needs to be.
I see. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes, I do.
And the same for the last one, last bullet point here, the last black square, as a process exists for the resolution. Either it goes up to the section where it says program task of sufficiently resourced, and we name it as one of the program tasks which needs to be sufficiently resourced, or we move it somewhere else.
Right. And I think the goal here is not to be all inclusive of all the things that should be resourced, but to give recommendations of things that should be resourced.
Yep.
And yeah.
But then we need to move it one level to the right, to, I don't know how to say it, but to a round circle as one of the program tasks which needs to be resourced efficiently.
I think what we have to do is say, tasks should be sufficiently resourced. For example, here are some, examples, but this is not a comprehensive list.
Yeah.
Well, I think Marcel's point, and I tend to agree looking at this more closely, is that in this section about resourcing, we're talking about a process to resolve identified issues, which doesn't really belong here in resourcing. But it does go in, it makes sense to put something in the section on license obligations, because in license obligations, it says we review and document stuff, but we never fix anything. If we find things that are broken, we don't fix it. And we should say something there.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's definitely worth trying to include, and I'll have to take an attempt to make this next major draft with these bullet shifts and additions.
And I think the next one I mentioned was the 3.2.2.5.
Oh, so back to the spec. No, let's see.
Yeah, here, because we are just in this section here, for example, the verification materials, 3.2.2.5. The documented procedure for handling the review and remediation of non-compliance cases. I guess, I don't know, but a documented procedure for handling this, is this really a verification material for effectively resourced program, or is this rather a verification material for the handling of non-compliance cases? And that's also a comment from us that the 3.2.2.5 verification material, I think we should move to another process, because a verification material for effectively resourced is rather something else, I guess.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. It's not as consistent with the topic, and I think that's a good piece of feedback. I think as long as what's important here is I think things can be moved. I think as long as we don't lose something that's valuable, and I think by moving it we won't lose it, right? Yeah. It will end up somewhere else that's more relevant. Good points. Any other comments about that? Okay.
Just a general comment that I think we're going to have a great opportunity to encourage the main list and maybe one of the main webinar calls to direct people to look at the recording of this to get an idea of the opportunity to shake things out here. So I'll take an action item on the next webinar to make sure that we talk to this call and its recording so people can jump in.
That'd be great. Okay, that was 57. Do you guys want to add anything else to this? Or, I mean, I think the other issues you have here are also similar in they're about architectural changes. Here we go. We can go over one more here.
Let me quickly read it again. Within 1.3 awareness, it is requested to be aware of the relevant open source objective. However, they are not mentioned anywhere else within requirements. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we suggest to mention objectives in the program scope. A written statement that clearly defines the scope, objectives, and limits of the program. Yeah. So And also we suggest to mention objectives as a policy, a documented open source policy that reflects the scope, objective, and limits of the program. Yeah, so yeah, reading it through several times and etc. We just realized that this verification material, as we say here, is the objectives of the open source program of open source usage, etc., are not requested anywhere else or not mentioned anywhere else. And we think it makes sense when we talk about a program scope and the policy that the objectives for should also be mentioned or should be defined by a company. And then it makes, of course, sense within the awareness section that people should know about the relevant open source objectives. But otherwise, when we don't define or when we don't request open source objectives and we don't ask a company to have objectives or define objectives, etc., then in the awareness part, I think we cannot ask them to be aware of the objectives. So either we get rid of the awareness of relevant open source objectives, or we at some point mention that objectives should be defined and in the program.
Okay, no, I think it's valid. I'm trying to think about whether we should remove it or we should include it.
I think, I mean, from the projects we've done with clients, it makes sense to define objectives. So what do we want to achieve with open source and with the open source program as well.
I think the challenge, and that might be the right way to go. When we have objectives, then everybody's going to have some kind of, interpretation of what that is, and we have to make sure it's not too prescriptive, and it's not. I don't think saying list your objectives. I think it's open-ended enough. It doesn't, restrict someone to. And I guess the question will always come up: what are examples of might be some objectives?
Actually, I think there is a mentioning of the objective in the introduction, but it's basically around building trust in the supply chain, which is, of course, a great objective. The objective of the specification itself.
Mm-hmm.
But I really don't think most people consider this to be the objective that they are addressing with their awareness.
Oh, I think it's a different objective, though. I think.
Yeah.
I think you're correct in that the introduction is trying to be very clear what the specs objective is.
Yeah.
I think what we're trying to do here is say, when you define your program or your program scope, you should include your objectives.
Yeah, it's two different objectives. Yeah, that's true, because as you say, the one objective is for OpenChain and our specification, and the other is the objective a company sets up for their open source program and for their open source usage and management.
Mm-hmm.
By just having the second unrelated one, I see the issue of actually confusing them. So
yeah. Mary, what is your thought about objectives? Does it make sense to more or less ask a company to have objectives defined for their program and the usage of open source, or do you think this is too much to ask for?
No, I think it totally makes sense, because this is why you're doing it. It's not just the demand that it be done, but it's why. And I think that's very, very important, especially as you're trying to get other people to execute this program, right? They need to know why they're doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I always look at objectives as success measurements, right? You only can realize success if you're meeting your objectives, and your objectives have to be spelled out. You can't get there if you don't know where you're going. So I think those are very good points. Okay. I think that's really great. Feedback. I'm going to have to go back and really study these last three topics that we discussed and start to make a major redraft of things and just put it out there for people to begin to chew on it. It'll be very preliminary kind of drafting of this, these ideas. Again, I'll be paying a lot of attention to making sure we, don't lose any semantics that we put in already. And two, if we're adding something around semantics, that we are very mindful and careful that that has been vetted. So with that, unless anybody else has any other thoughts or feedback, I'd like to conclude our meeting here.
Okay. Well, I'd like to take up objectives a little bit because, Mark, what you said was a little bit different than what I was thinking, because you're talking about objectives as in KPIs. I was really talking about objectives as what is it that we're trying to achieve, not necessarily KPIs. I think maybe identifying KPIs is not what we're going to do here.
I don't know exactly what a KPI is, but I know the word objectives is used often in business, right? And it's really like, what are you trying to achieve? Why do you exist?
Right.
I think of it in a more generic sense, although I'm sure you can map that into a more specific kind of goal setting process. I wasn't thinking about a goal setting process. Does that, let's spend a little bit of time then talking about what is an objective in this context while we have everybody here. So Mary, when you think of an objective, what are some examples of objectives you would expect to see?
Okay, so at this level of a document, I would think that it would be a high level thing like objective is to reduce legal risk for the organization or be a good software citizen in the global software stage or something like that. Something really fairly high level that kind of helps people have a little bit of a vision of why we're doing this.
Okay.
Versus, any kind of measure.
Yeah, I wasn't.
Although I could see somebody interpreting it as a measure, and maybe that's fine.
I mean,
yeah,
objectives I've seen so far was also something like attract new digital talents for the company might be an objective as well, or of course, license compliance, but also something like reducing time to market, reducing cost, collaboration, setting standards, etc. I think there are lots of different objectives companies have. It's also depending on the actually industry and company size what their objective is, I guess. So for example, like large organization might want to set standards through open source and be relevant on the market. Smaller companies might rather perhaps reduce cost in the development and therefore use as much open source as possible, or others might want to attract, as I say, talents. So I think there are many different objectives, and it's correct. I mean, if someone asks for it, some could be mentioned as examples, but of course, it's absolutely up to the individual organization to set their objectives. So there we shouldn't come up with any
specifics. Yeah.
Any specifics,
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Yeah, and I agree with all that. That makes sense. When I say objectives, I know that when they're high level, even if they're high level, like attract talent, it's telling you that you exist. This program exists because you want to attract talent, and hopefully, you're setting your program up to succeed at that, right? But yeah, I don't necessarily see it as a hardcore measurable objective. I don't think that would be a good thing at all. Okay. All right.
Mark, one other question. Were these all the comments we put in, or was this the last one, the number 58, or was there anything else? Just to have an overview.
There I think are some more, but I have to take this right now and start to frame it out a little, and then we can
and then we can discuss the next one.
My goal is actually to, I think we made some good major decisions here, kind of like we're gonna talk about I was even thinking when we were even started this meeting, we were going to think about a 2-year time frame possibly to release this, right? I was thinking of a very different time frame, and I think that this feedback is very helpful for recalibrating how we go about this process. So I would like to take these 3 core pieces and take the document and start to shift it around a little bit to give people something to look at, and then start looking at all the other feedback in that context. I feel like from my perspective, and it's a good perspective, right? It's a good change. We are going to be moving and in a slightly different direction. And I want to set it up so that all future feedback we put in that new directional perspective.
Good.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. That
Hey,
concludes
thank
our
you.
meeting for today. Go ahead, Shane.
No, I just think thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.